Welcome. This is Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar series brings together the most distinguished members of the Georgetown University faculty and alumni community to talk about the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Well, today, it gives me a great pleasure to present my friend and colleague, Andrew Imbrie, to talk about something that is probably on everybody's mind. And if it isn't on your mind, it should be on your mind, because I guarantee if you have kids in school, it is on their mind. Artificial intelligence, what every citizen should know. Now, let me say a couple words about Andrew. Andrew, as you can see, is the Gracias Chair for Security and Emerging Technology in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. He did his undergraduate at Connecticut College, but we forgive him for that because he then came to Georgetown and did both a master's degree from the Walsh School of Foreign Service and a PhD from the Department of Government. He has had a distinguished career in public service. He was a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He served in policy planning at the State Department. He was an advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and he was a speechwriter to former Secretary of State John Kerry. He has also, in the midst of all that work, maintained an amazing scholarly profile, writing in numerous publications, and in particular, has written two very, very important books. His first book was entitled Power on the Precipice: The 6 Choices America Faces in a Turbulent World. It was published by Yale University Press in 2020. And his second book, which is very much on point to the topic for today, he co-wrote with another Georgetown alum, Ben Buchanan, and it's entitled The New Fire: War, Peace, and Democracy in the Age of AI. So it's an honor to have Andrew with us today. I'm going to turn it over to him to talk a little bit about AI and what all of us as citizens should know. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Tony, it is wonderful to be here with you. I really can't think of a more thoughtful interlocutor on these issues. And I'm really excited to get to talk about a topic that I think is on everyone's minds right now. It's certainly blared across the headlines. And so my hope with the short presentation is to just give everyone some context to help demystify and make sense of what's going on day to day, and then to step back and ask some bigger questions that will be important to guide us in the future. So I'm really excited to get started. And as you can see on this first slide, this is just a small smattering of headlines from the recent news. And if you look at the different headlines, you can see some themes that pop out: questions around democracy and integrity, geopolitics, US-China relations, the role of AI both as an engine for growth and innovation, but also real concerns about its safety profile and risk assessments. And so one of the things that I take away when I look at these headlines is, first, narratives really matter. You know, how we all talk about AI matters. How the public understands this technology, this constellation of technologies, matters for how it will be integrated and adopted, for how stabilizing or destabilizing it might be, for the risks that we can help hopefully mitigate together, and for the benefits it might bring. And so the way we talk about it as citizens really matters. The second is that, as you can see from the headlines, the risks and the benefits are coming at us at the same time. You know, this makes this technology really challenging, because there's so many things we want it for, right? To help us with science, with weather modeling and climate mapping, you know, to identify antibiotics for drug-resistant pathogens. There's a lot of really promising use cases, but there are real risks, and we have to deal with them simultaneously, and there are a whole host of trade-offs that we have to manage in the process. The third thing that I think is really important to take away from these headlines, and why I'm so glad we're having this conversation with all of you, is that this isn't just the domain of technical experts, right? It's really important because it implicates fundamental values in our societies and economies. And so everybody needs to be involved and part of the conversation. And we all have a role to play as translators between fields of technical endeavor and much broader public policy conversations. You know, this is really a technology that has been pioneered not in government, but in industry, in academic research centers, in labs. And so it flips an equation that we were long used to in the United States during the Cold War. On the left, you see this 100-foot tower for the Trinity test in July of 1945 when they tested the world's first atomic bomb. And this process was cross-cutting, right? Cross-sectoral in our society. It was international, but it was really government-led. And that was a model of innovation that Vannevar Bush and others helped initiate and propel into the 1950s and 60s and onward. And that's a time when the US government occupied a large share of R&D, of research and development domestically, and a significant share of global research and development. But if you look today, that equation has really flipped. The picture on the right shows you a recent AI model by the company DeepMind that went up against one of the world's Go champions. Go is one of the oldest games, and it's really a complex game, a game of intuition. And there are more possible moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe squared. That is, if every atom had a universe of atoms in it. So to design an AI model that could play the game at that level was thought to be not possible anywhere in the near term, and yet they did it. And this was a small company, just with a couple researchers. This was not a massive government-led project. So it really kind of gives you an intuition, a sense for how things are changing. The other big theme that I want you to think about in the short presentation here is just the rate of improvement, the rate of progress. And you can see here that what this shows is a recent company's innovation that many of you might be familiar with, OpenAI. And they put forward these two very powerful models called GPT 3.5 and GPT 4. That stands for Generalized Pre-trained Transformer. And the blue shows you how the older model did on a range of benchmarks and tests. And the green shows you what the new model, just a few months later that they released, did, and how well it did on some scores like the LSAT tests or AP tests. And it really surprised everybody. And there are important caveats with its results here, but I want everyone to kind of hold in their mind sort of two tension points. One is the extraordinary awe and wonder and rapid development of these capabilities, but also of their limitations and weaknesses and potential risks. And you sort of have to keep them both in tension in your mind in the same time. But this is certainly an evidence that not only is innovation shifting to many other actors in our innovation ecosystem, but it's also just happening at such a speed of progress that it's hard for governance structures to keep up. So here's a quick roadmap of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to help you navigate some of the terminology behind AI, what it is, why it's important to get these definitions right, and to help you sort of make sense of what you're reading in the news. And then we'll talk about 5 quick key insights from my new book with Ben Buchanan, The New Fire. So what is AI? Well, it's important actually to get this right because it's not just a pedantic debate. It's actually really important to figure out what we mean by AI for the purposes of regulation, for governance, thinking about tech protection schemes like export controls or investment screening. And it's difficult because experts disagree about this and concepts are evolving. They're changing very fast. There are many different subfields of AI. So there's no one easy definition. And often when I teach classes on this, you get a whole range of initial answers at the start of semester about what AI might mean. So let me just walk you through what I think is a helpful framework for navigating this. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, put out a model of this called sort of the 3 waves of AI. The first wave was about description. It was, you could think of it as these expert systems. It's as if I worked with Tony as an expert on international law, and I tried to hand code in all of his knowledge step by step into a model. And that model could have a set of rules, a set of facts, and it would be able to produce answers based on Tony's specialized knowledge. And these kinds of systems had advantages. We knew where the knowledge came from. We could trace it back, but they weren't learning and adapting over time. And there was a competitor system sort of lurking in the background called machine learning. And that brings us into the second wave, the categorize. This is sort of, instead of step-by-step programming, we're doing statistical pattern matching. These are systems that can learn and adapt. And it's this ability to learn as opposed to rote execution that makes them so powerful. And then the third wave is about explanation, contextual adaptation. This is designing systems that are more general purpose, that can adapt across contexts. And that's still a struggle. That's something that people are trying to figure out how to do and how to do safely. And a quick way of thinking about what the dominant sort of subfield of AI today is machine learning. And my colleague Ben Buchanan and I define it as a process of instructing computers to execute algorithms that learn from data. So it's really driven by these three sparks of computing power, algorithmic advances, and lots of data. And not just quantities of data, but hopefully high quality data. And these three combined have really driven a lot of modern machine learning's progress. And it's why we're all having this conversation today. A subfield of machine learning is called deep learning. And this is referring to a set of statistical techniques that are composed of these layers of neurons that you can see in this image that loosely model the neurons in our brain. So you can imagine if you had a model like this and you asked it, can you please predict whether we're looking at a dog or a cat? And you would take the pixels from those images and layer them in the input layer. They would take those and perform some computations. Think of each neuron as sort of a function that tallies up the weighted sum of earlier inputs. And then they would cascade through the network and produce an output. And let's say the output was wrong. Let's say that you wanted to classify as a cat, but it's saying it's a dog. What the model ends up doing is you can compute the error, how far off it is from its predicted value to the real value. And then you can figure out through some fancy techniques how to update those arrows, those weights or connections between the neurons so that that actually predicts the right outcome. And I'm happy to go into Q&A if folks are interested later, but that's generally the model of deep learning. And I just want to show you an example of what sort of the buzzword of the moment is, which is generative AI. And this is a kind of AI model that produces content. You know, it doesn't just classify or recognize images. It doesn't just cluster or group data among customer segments, for example. It actually produces content like audio or video or imagery. So let's take a look. I just thought this would be an interesting exercise to show people. So if we look at, let's say we go into a model from OpenAI DALL-E and we say Georgetown University at sunset in the style of Monet, and see what it produces. And you can see here that it's producing imagery, right, generating something, and it's based on a complex process that we could talk about. But this is what's taken the world in some ways by storm and created a whole host of implications for all of us to think about what this means for our economies and our society. And one of the powerful ways to do that is with these very large language models that are trained to predict the next word in the sentence. And OpenAI's model, these GPT models that I've told you about, have been quite powerful, and they've been extremely large, which means that they require a lot of money to train. And only a few companies can produce these very large models. And when they're really large like this, and they're trained at scale to perform a whole range of tasks, they're called foundational models, and people can build on top of them. And one of the big questions is, how do we make sure these models are safe? How do we make sure that we're distributing access to different resources to do research in this area? And how do we innovate responsibly? Okay, so that's an introduction to sort of how to think about some of the key concepts in AI. Here are 5 insights I'll leave you with that I think are really important for navigating this terrain. The first is that AI is akin to fire. In some ways, AI is a general purpose technology. And the scholar Jeff Ding, I think, has a really nice definition of this, which is these are technologies that drive fundamental economic advances. They connect with many other innovations in society. They're constantly improving. They have many different application areas. And the wide range of outcomes that we have to confront with AI is truly mind-boggling. And if you think back to some of the most foundational advances, right, the power to stop, control, and start fires, this was foundational to civilization, to many technologies that followed, from steam propulsion and metal forging and glass making and electricity. And it was really important for humanity. But fire was also harnessed for destruction, for warfare. And in many ways, I think AI is akin to that kind of wide range of possibilities. There's so many outcomes over so many different timescales that we really have to be prepared and ready ourselves and think ahead, both to the real risks right now and to the risks on the horizon. There's another way in which AI is akin to fire, which is that its underlying components, remember I mentioned this as a definition of machine learning, that it's a process of using computers to execute algorithms that learn from the data. all three of these underlying sparks are rapidly improving. And so just to give you an intuition for that, we're seeing massive growth in the amount of data. Some estimates say it's doubling every 2 years. And data is really important for training a lot of these models. But the challenge is not just having a lot of data. You need to have representative, high quality data. And that's harder to come by. And I think that will be an increasingly noteworthy issue to follow. And a lot of the data that people are working with, right, it has bias. And so we have to make sure that the data isn't just high quality, but you're rooting out the bias, making sure that you're very careful about what you're training on. And turning that raw data into a usable format, cleaning it, aggregating it, transforming it is very costly and time consuming. And so that's a big part of the sort of big data economy that isn't often talked about, but is very important for understanding the future of the field. We've also seen rapid improvement in algorithmic efficiency, doubling every 16 months. If you look at this chart on the right, I know it probably doesn't mean a lot to too many folks, but if you look down here at AlexNet at the bottom left-hand corner, this was a supervised learning algorithm that did very well on an early benchmark test called ImageNet. And today, you need 44 times less computing power to achieve those kinds of results that AlexNet did. So you're talking about rapid improvements in the ability of algorithms, and that means that you need sort of less and less computing power to be able to drive them forward. But the interesting thing is, of course, computing power is surging ahead. And people listening might have heard of Moore's law, this ability of the number of transistors on a chip to double every 2 years. That drove advances in the industry for a really long time. And there's some evidence that that's been slowing down for a variety of reasons. But the amount of computing power used to train these machine learning models has just kept going up and up, something like by a factor of 300,000 between 2012 and 2019. So if the phones in your battery had that kind of improvement, they'd last for 800 years. So we're really talking about something that's hard to get your mind around, these kinds of improvement curves. But it's very important because a big debate in the field right now is, how do we get them to the next stage of progress? Do we just scale these models? Do we make them bigger with more computing power and more data? Or do we need fundamental algorithmic advances that are more grounded in facts or truth? And this is a real debate in the field, and it's how we're hopefully going to get to that next stage, which is explanation, adaptation, a more sort of safe and responsible and more general purpose kind of model. Second key insight, right, is that AI has a lot of potential to do good, not just to play games, but to actually solve real problems. And I want to give you one example of that I think is very compelling. So going back to the company DeepMind, they were pioneering AI gameplay, and it was very impressive. And then they realized, well, we've got to prove the value of this. And one of the problems that had bedeviled biochemistry for a long time was understanding how proteins fold. And proteins are big molecules made up of these smaller chains of amino acids, and they're unstable, so the amino acids fold in these 3D shapes that determine their function. And if you can figure out this problem about how the different protein structures fold, it can make a huge difference for treating diseases like Alzheimer's or ALS or Parkinson's or universal flu vaccines, or helping to target cancers and strengthen your immune system. So it's really important to sort of figure this out, but it would take people many, many years to actually do this work. A typical PhD would work on how a single protein would fold through X-ray crystallization. You crystallize the protein and fire X-rays at it. And there's different, more modern methods, but it was a really tough problem. And the company took this on. They had access to a lot of data through this protein data bank, and they were fortunate to have a competition that they could actually benchmark the results in. And they built a model that did very well. If you look at the modeling accuracy here, this competition had been going on for a while, and when their model, AlphaFold, entered in 2018, it bested the competition, almost 60% on what's called a global distance test. And the following competition in 2020, it essentially proclaimed the problem solved, and it did extraordinarily well. And I would say, there's still, there's still a bit to go. There's still sort of interesting interactive effects that we need to figure out, but that the model really made a big difference and a massive headway. And they've now released the protein structures for something like 200 million proteins. So it's extraordinarily impressive results that could really help us treat diseases and in drug discovery. So at the same time, for all the benefits that I've just described, AI can also cause enormous harm. And on the left here, you have a little bit of a model of what AlphaFold looks like. And then on the right here, you have something else, which is a researchers who had been working on a model to treat diseases and to sort of help predict molecules that can help do that. They actually thought, well, what if we can figure out how to forecast what the misuses might be so we can guard against them? And as part of a conference, they did this and basically turned their model away from toxicity to actually trying to predict toxic molecules. And it did it on produced 40,000 toxic molecules, including VX and some other more lethal agents as well. And so it started to raise this question of, well, how do we make sure that we get all the benefits from these models and not create enormous risks in the process? And it's important to note that there's a big difference between the modeling that's done here and actually what would need to happen for this to become a real world risk, access to physical materials. But there's an important op-ed that I think came out from a colleague of mine, Steph Vitalis, that said, some of these models can help you reduce jargon, get more information about how to do these sorts of toxic molecule predictions, and that should be concerning. And we need to think as a community about how to right-size the risk and how to make sure that we're putting guardrails on these models, but also being responsible about how we communicate this research and safeguard some of the physical materials that could actually make it a real threat. So something to think about, because I do think these kinds of biorisks are concerning. One way to think about the field of AI safety is in these three big buckets. So how do we make models that aren't biased, that are what's called robust? How do we make sure we know what's going on inside them, right? In terms of transparency, can we actually understand how the models make their predictions? And then third, alignment. How do we make sure that these models are aligned with human objectives? And that's called specification. I can give you some examples here. There's been some research, important research done that some of these facial recognition systems that use AI algorithms, are biased, are flawed, that don't do well on different skin tones. And this creates all sorts of problems for society. And one of the concerns is that it's certainly bad when you discover a biased system, but it's even worse if you don't discover it and it persists and it plays a role in making important decisions in sentencing or credit or tenant screening. And there's been a lot of studies done that this is still a major problem of bias in data and of flaws in the way that these models are being deployed. And so it's really important that we're all aware of this, we get ahead of it, we pay appropriate attention to it, because there are real world harms that are happening now, and it's important for policy to address it. Another big concern is just understanding what's going on inside of these models. And the original Grace Hopper is a wonderful figure in the modern computer science history. And she played a role in the Mark I, Mark II computers, helped actually give us the sort of phrase debugging. And back when she was doing her work in the World War II and post-war period, the process for figuring out how to debug and how to understand these systems was a little more straightforward. You would sort of run the code in different directions. You do it iteratively. You figure out forwards and backwards if the code looked correct, and you try to make sure that it was transparent and behaved as appropriately. But with machine learning systems, this is much more difficult. They're designed iteratively, and it's just simply too hard to test every possible parameter in these billion or trillion parameter models. And so there is real concern about how do these systems reason under uncertainty, what features are most important to them. And if you can't figure out exactly how it makes decisions, if you can't figure out at the level of individual circuits, what's going on, that may not bother some people if it comes to things like helping you prevent, get early stage diagnosis of cancer. But maybe it's concerning when it comes to sentencing or tenant screening or educational decisions or in the criminal justice system, where there is a tension or a trade-off between effectiveness and explainability. So this is really getting at the question of calibrating trust. When do we trust these models, and when should we be more critical, and how do we think about that in the dynamic of humans partnering or teaming with machines? It's going to be a big debate going forward. And then, of course, alignment and specification. One of the challenges is we really need to figure out how we can make these systems do what we want them to do to stay aligned with our objectives. And if you look at some of these models, and on the right, there's a famous example of the game Coast Runners from OpenAI. One of the things that they did with this game is they asked, well, I want to make sure that this AI model gets as many points as possible. And so the boat would be steaming around in this harbor and it finds a loophole, which is it just starts crashing into a bunch of ships and looping in a circle. And it scored a lot of points doing it that way, ironically, but it's not what the designers wanted. And what we realized is we should have said, we want you to complete the course as fast as possible and score the most amount of points. And that seems like a trivial example, but it's actually really important because it's very difficult to convey and incentivize desired behaviors. And it's so difficult to really be able to take an objective, turn it into a good proxy, and instruct a machine on what you want it to do. Sometimes these models will do literally what you tell them to do. And so it can raise a whole host of problems, especially if you can imagine as these models are integrated in safety critical systems or in critical infrastructure. So another safety issue to be concerned about. The final issue is just a lack of common sense. The model here is something that a researcher foregrounded, which I think is important. A lot of these models just don't reason the same way that human beings do. And sometimes it results in nonsensical answers. And this is important because as these models become more and more general purpose, and as they're deployed in more and more settings, we have to be mindful of their capabilities and of the context in which they're deployed. And if we get that wrong, it could actually result in very bad outcomes. So getting to this place of, how can we design models with more common sense is really important for the field. The fourth and penultimate insight I want everyone to think about is that you really can't separate technical advances from geopolitics. Geopolitics infuses a lot of these innovations, and you can see that in cybersecurity, in nuclear weapons technology, and strategic stability and disinformation, foreign policy, national security minds, but also the broader public are going to have to think about these consequences because in many ways, they are coming at us faster than ever before. Let me give you two examples. So a couple of years ago, DARPA hosted a cyber grand challenge where they winnowed it down from 100 to 7 systems. These were sort of very adept bug hunting systems in an automated tournament. And they were given the task of defending code, finding and fixing vulnerabilities, keeping the software up and running, and then actually finding flaws in their opponents' systems and exploiting them. And it was a moment where people started to ask, will automated methods or even machine learning help actually advance cyber operations, cyber offense, cyber defense? And there's been a lot of research since, a lot of questions about this, whether on the offense side, it will shift the way we think about vulnerability discovery or propagation in networks or obfuscating, building malware that can evade detection. Maybe it will help defenders do better to detect phishing scams or fraud scams or malware detection or attribution. But the challenge with a lot of these models, as you can imagine from our discussion so far, is that they not only might affect cyber operations or cyber defense, they also have flaws themselves. And many machine learning models are vulnerable to being hacked. And so that's a whole new area of concern and a whole new area of focus about how we can make sure we leverage these for good, for let's say for cyber defense, but also make sure that we're not creating new vulnerabilities in the process. Disinformation is another key concern. At a center I'm affiliated with, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, they did an early report on this where they got access to GPT-3, one of the OpenAI large language model versions. And they saw with a little human prompting, what could it do? Would it speak in the idiom of conspiracy theories? Could they get it to do narrative persuasion or try to drive a wedge between different audiences? Or were there concerns about things like climate change denial or even persuading people? And they showed with some curation and with some responsible research that these risks are real. And it's something to really think about because in many ways, you don't need access to the most sophisticated models to do harm, especially if the models can produce some usable prompts and output. Maybe that actually helps more actors be involved in spewing disinformation. Maybe that makes disinformation harder to detect or more creative and less discoverable. Perhaps it creates new kinds of behaviors that we have to look out for, like more personalized propaganda at scale, or what might be called deliberative distraction in democracies during public comment periods on laws and regulations. So it's really something that we also need to get ahead of, to be mindful of what the real risks are, to be careful in our measurement, but also to let people know about this as citizens, especially with elections coming up. The integrity of elections is essential, and we want to make sure that bad actors aren't misusing these tools. this is a longstanding concern in the field is with deepfakes, the ability to create new imagery. And you can see on the right that these deepfakes have gotten more and more realistic over time. And they're now becoming multimodal with video. And sometimes we've seen that this threat, it's hard to sort of scale what the threat really is and understand the risk. And we need a lot more research to really grapple with it. But it's another area of AI and disinformation that we need to be mindful of, and to think about how we can do better on real-time detection and how we can equip our citizens with the tools they need on digital literacy to make informed judgments, and to work with industry partners to make sure that when we construct models, when we give access to them, that we're doing it safely and responsibly. The last insight I'll share with you is that there are a lot of big questions about what this technology will mean for the fate of democracy, for the fate and future of democracy. And there is an assumption out there that democracies are at a disadvantage, that they're decentralized, cacophonous, haphazard. They won't be able to leverage the technology beyond advertising or product development, but that's a real disadvantage against what might be much more determined and resolved authoritarian competitors that have incentives to deploy these technologies at scale, that are more centralized, might have access to more centralized data, and they might be able to compel adoption in different ways. And I do think that this narrative is out there, but I think it's fatalistic, and that there are still ways that we can shape this terrain and help create a more hopeful and promising future for this technology. And I'll end on this note. One of my colleagues at Georgetown had a really interesting phrase, Charles King. He said, "The antidote to hopelessness isn't hope, it's planning." And I do think that we need some concerted planning in governments, with industry and academic partners and civil society, and with all of you, with people in the public who are coming up and confronting this technology every day. And I do think there are 4 big areas that we need to think about collectively together. So first and foremost is people. It's the talent that underpins the growth and development of these models. And I think it's really important we invest together in domestic AI education pipelines and workforce development, and to make sure that we're doing this, because in many respects, we're going to have significant gaps on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics talent. And you can see it today with the design and construction of semiconductor fabrication facilities in the United States. We need significant engineering and construction talent. There's a lot of job opportunities for people without college degrees or non-traditional pathways, for quantum information sciences, for so many areas. Domestic pipelines of talent are going to be really important to track and develop. We also can make investments in immigration reform. We can think about how to build a community of developers and deployers that's more diverse, more representative of our society. So people is the foundation. On technology, there are things we can do to help preserve privacy. There's a set of technologies called privacy enhancing technologies that allow you to do data analysis without necessarily getting access to everybody's data in the pools. We can do more watermarking to try to prevent the proliferation of deep fakes from polluting our information systems. We can try to explore smaller data approaches to AI. So there's people investments, there's technology investments. Geopolitically, one of the big advantages for the United States is we have a broad network of allies and partners. And the good news is that we are already working with them very hard on things like standards, interoperability, research and development, safety, and mitigating risks. And I think America really needs to leverage that, because the more partners that we have, the better. And I think that's a crucial comparative advantage. And the last piece is governance, and there really is what's called in the field a sort of pacing challenge between the rapid development of these technologies and the ability of law, of policy, and of governance regimes to keep up. All of you, I think, might have seen the recent executive order that the Biden-Harris administration released. There's a lot of good progress that's happening, a lot of good work to try to make sure that we're developing these models responsibly, that we're sharing information, that we're promoting transparency, where appropriate, granting model access and developing much more fine-grained evaluations to be able to forecast what these dangerous capabilities might be, but also to be able to help the field innovate and to meet important societal challenges that affect all of us, from food security to climate to health. And so I do think ending on a note of hope is really where I come down on this issue. And if it is the new fire, really it falls to us. It's the choices we make, it's how we tend it together. And I'm hopeful in every conversation I've had with students, with people in the public, that there are enough good people who want to help bend the curve toward toward the public good, toward the common good, that we can do it together. And so I'm really delighted to talk with Tony about this, with all of you, and thanks a lot for your time and for listening.
Andrew, thank you for a brilliant presentation, and there is so much there. I'm going to encourage people to put questions in the chat box that you have on your screen. And as people are doing that, I want to just ask one question. You mentioned the executive order that was recently promulgated by President Biden to try to regulate artificial intelligence. One of our alums, Senator John Ossoff, chairs the subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee on Human Rights and Law, and this has been an area of great interest to him as well. And one of the things that's come out from the Judiciary Committee and some of his hearings has been the question of whether there should be both some kind of international regulatory body and some kind of domestic body. So, for example, we have the International Telecommunications Union at the international level to try to regulate issues relating to that. Domestically, we have the FCC, which seeks to regulate things like that. And I'd love to hear your views on whether we should move in that direction. The one thing that was impressed upon me as I watched some of these hearings was how much bipartisanship there was on this. Because, for instance, Senator Lindsey Graham was saying we need to have some kind of regulation, and also the sense of urgency in moving forward, because nuclear technology was bad enough without it being regulated, but it also developed very slowly. This, as you note, is developing just like that. So, any ideas or views you might want to share about either international regulatory bodies, the potential for them, or domestic regulatory bodies?
Tony, this is something I'd love to talk to you about, because I feel that you have great expertise in these areas. I think there's a really interesting debate happening about how agencies can leverage first their current authorities and what might be possible, right? So whether it's the FDA with medical devices or the FAA, the FCC, there's so many different agencies that have authorities on the books, but some might not have administrative subpoena authority, some might not have the regulations that they need, and we need to look at that. We need to understand what kind of interpretive guidance is needed and where we can leverage our current principles, our bedrock principles as a country, and where agencies have the ability to govern and regulate AI, where they might be able to actually develop more procedural guidance in the process. So I think that's important, just a stock taking of what's possible. I think many agencies are doing that now, and with the executive order, there's a certain marching orders for everybody to figure this out. And I think there are some questions though about these very large, what are called foundational models that I talked about, that have capabilities that are sometimes difficult to forecast. They're difficult to align and make perfectly safe. And that might require adjustments, right? Or that might require a new approach or a new agency at the domestic or the international levels. I think the challenge is, these technologies are different. They're moving so fast. The governments aren't in the lead. We don't always have the horizon scanning capabilities to monitor and measure what they're doing and who has what, and to know the ground truth. So my instinct is, we can't dawdle. We have to treat this as an urgent challenge, but we have to be thoughtful and deliberative in the process to make sure we're striking the right balance across all these different equities. I do think incident reporting is really important, making sure that we have an understanding sector by sector of what's going on. I think companies, it's really important for them to report on capabilities, to do this kind of red teaming testing internally and externally, and to build a sort of factual foundation so we have better understanding and better visibility into these models, that we elevate best practices, and that we create regimes and explore different options, whether that's on liability or licensing and registration. So I don't have a definitive answer on yes or no. We need an international global governing body. The UN is certainly making moves in this direction with its high-level advisory group. The OECD, the G7, there's so many efforts underway. I think we've seen in the past really interesting regulatory and procedural innovations from agencies to try to grapple with new challenges. So what I'd like to see is sort of see where those efforts go, have conversations now about building a monitoring and measurement infrastructure so we know what's happening, and push forward the commitments that we've seen recently with the executive order, and then explore what might be needed, where the gaps are, and whether a new agency domestically or internationally helps fill those gaps effectively without duplicating anything. And I think there's room for robust disagreement and legitimate opinions on all sides on that. But that's hopefully going to happen sooner than later because there's not a lot of time to waste.
That makes good sense. And I also think taking an assessment of existing agencies and what they're doing and what their remit is on these things is really very important, because you don't want to be in a situation where you move too quickly to create something and then find that the technology outstrips it and the agencies or institutions you've created aren't capable of dealing with that. One of the general problems of international law and international institutions is that sometimes the institution is created based on a given technology, and then once the technology develops and changes, that existing institution or legal rule no longer makes any sense. I'm going to ask, and I see our time is short, I'm going to ask one question, and I'm going to read this because it's a very detailed question. I think it raised some very important issues. So there's been a lot of focus on the size and development of models, primarily focused on closed versus open source. But what about the hardware aspect of this? We're seeing corporations make deals for GPU use, most recently between Microsoft and Oracle to power Bing AI. Should the US be taking a more direct position to address the manufacturing and tracking of GPUs? And you might want to define what a GPU is, because I don't know what it is.
This is a great question. Whoever asked it, thank you for the insightful question. So, we all know kind of these CPUs, these traditional chips, and then there's special chips, AI chips, accelerators that can do machine learning calculations quite well. And GPUs were really prominent in video games. And all of a sudden we realized recent years that they're useful for machine learning. And so they've attracted a lot of attention. And, there's, I think, a really big debate right now about how important computing power is in that triad that I described. And it presents something physical that you can control and track. And so a lot of people are looking at this to say, well, actually, maybe this might be something where we can track computing chip clusters or training runs, and to think about, whether there's a threshold at which this becomes something concerning or needs to be monitored. And I think there's a lot of interesting work about how to track and monitor and do that. I'll say a couple of things. One is that it's important to have a better definition and understanding of what these foundational or frontier models are. And computing power is a big part of that, but it's only a part of it. And there are other ways to sort of think about these models. And while we're going to need to think about reporting and sharing information from red teaming exercises from companies, and this is one way to track these big systems, there's also, thinking about data, thinking about algorithmic development. So we have to be mindful of that. And we also have to be mindful that we need to distribute access, of course, to these resources to many other researchers, and so that we distribute the goods of opportunity and make sure that more people can research in the field. And if we pull on one lever more than others, we just have to be mindful of the trade-offs and not to entrench incumbents, and to make sure that we're giving opportunity for startups and other businesses and academic researchers. And the other issue that I think is important is, in one survey that the Center for Security and Emerging Technology did recently of AI researchers, they weren't all uniform in the view that more computing power was the most important thing for them. And in some cases, what was really important to them, if they had more money, was actually more talent or more data. So we should be thinking about kind of how we calibrate the resources of AI, of modern AI. And so I do think that looking at computing is a really important threshold. It's a really important point of control, both domestically, but also internationally for geopolitical reasons. But it's not the only point of control. And we should just be mindful that there are unintended consequences from pulling on one lever too much. And so we just need to strike the right balance across all these fundamental resources. Computing power is certainly one of them, but there are others as well.
Thank you. And believe it or not, we are out of time. This is just flown by. One question someone raised, and I have the answer to this. They said, will the PowerPoint slides be available? The answer is yes. We are recording this, and this is going to be posted on YouTube. And so you'll have the full presentation with the PowerPoint slides. So it will be available for viewing, for sharing with classes and colleagues. And I'm sure Andrew would be more than happy to hear from you if anybody has any further questions. Let me thank.
I would be delighted. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Let me thank Andrew Imbrie. Let's all give a virtual shout out to Andrew for an amazing, detailed cornucopia of a presentation Thank you so much. So we really, really appreciate it. We could go on for several hours on this. I want to thank Kelly Young of the Georgetown University Alumni Association, the Office of Advancement, for her support. I want to thank all of you for attending this webinar. And again, it will be available to view again on the YouTube channel. I hope to see you in a couple of months for another SFS Online and On Topic. Have an amazing day. And again, Andrew, thank you so much.
It was wonderful to be here. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to you and Kelly. It was a great conversation. Wish we could go even longer.